Even the Indians leave in the summer. Does your husband know this? He does. The Shoshone Indians bring us supplies, and they've warned him. Anthony couldn't help but feel a deep interest in the woman's fate. As he watched the embers of the fire, he sensed her gaze on him. "Wansfell, you have a kind heart," she said. "Your kindness and interest soften my doubts about men. We are strangers, but there's something about this desert that makes me want to open up to you. My husband knows that Death Valley is a hell on earth, and so do I. But that's why he brought me here. That's why I came." Anthony couldn't believe what he was hearing. Dismukes had prepared him for tragedy. The desert had shown him many dark and terrible calamities, misfortunes, mysteries. He had imagined he could no longer be thrown off his balance by a maze. But when he met Magdalene Viré, he was taken aback. She was a woman of refinement and education, far removed from the ruggedness of the desert west. Yet she spoke of murder and suicide with such conviction that Anthony couldn't help but believe her. As he looked into Magdalene's eyes, he saw a passion and willpower that he had never witnessed before. She was a puzzle to him, unlike any of the women he had met in the desert. He knew she spoke the truth, and he couldn't help but feel drawn to her. Anthony offered to take Magdalene away from Death Valley, but she refused. She and her husband had traveled 3,000 miles to get there, and she had no intention of leaving. Elliot Viré had always been fascinated by Death Valley, and he had a reason for finding a hell on earth. Magdalene's refusal to leave puzzled Anthony, but he knew that some things were impossible to explain. He couldn't force her to leave, but he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of concern for her. The desert was a dangerous place, and he knew that anything could happen. "Maybe we should move our camp up higher," I suggested. "There's better water and trees there, and it's not as hot and stuffy." But she shook her head, her voice bitter. "We don't need a beautiful and comfortable camp, Viré." "Well, let me move your shack, then," I said, gesturing across the wash. "This spot is dangerous. That mountain up there is moving. The whole slope is sliding like a glacier. One little slip could start an avalanche. Rocks are rolling down all the time." "I've heard them," she said, shuddering. "Cracking and ringing in the dead of night. I hate them. These rolling rocks are like living things. I've heard them slide and crack, roll and ring, hitting the sand with a thump, and then with a whistle and thud they're gone. People like me who live like this know nothing of the elements. I used to have no fear of the desert or Death Valley. I laughed at the idea that any barren wild valley, any maelstrom of the sea, any Sodom of a city could be worse than the chaos of my soul. But I didn't know. I'm human. I'm a woman. A woman is supposed to bear children. Nothing else. And now I'm afraid of the dark. These rolling rocks get on my nerves. I wait and listen for them, and I pray. The silence is even worse. It's insupportable, and the loneliness. This desolate, forsaken place called Death Valley was enough to drive anyone mad. Magdalene Viré knew this all too well. She tried to keep her feelings hidden, but Anthony's sympathy broke down her walls, and she couldn't help but speak her mind. Her words flowed out of her in a passionate stream, revealing her fears and loneliness. Anthony understood all too well the intensity of her emotions, especially as a woman in this harsh environment. He offered to move her camp to a safer location, but she refused. She seemed to be facing something beyond his words, something that made her hide her face in her hands. After a long silence, she looked up at him, seemingly composed once again. She thanked him for listening, but begged him not to tell her husband anything she had said. Anthony promised to stay as long as she was there, and his simple words and physical presence seemed to offer her some comfort. In this place where survival was a daily struggle, it was clear that Magdalene was fighting not only Death Valley, but also some terrible relationship with her husband. Anthony's words hinted at the fact that she was fighting alone, and this realization must have been a heavy burden to bear. "Do you really want to stay here and serve me?" she whispered. "Yes," Anthony replied. "Viré won't like that," she warned. "I'm not sure, but I don't think it'll make any difference to me what he likes," Anthony answered. "If you are kind to me, he will drive you away," she said, agitated. "Well, as he's your husband, he may prevent me from being kind, but he can't drive me away," Anthony assured her. "But suppose I ask you to go," she asked. "If that's the greatest kindness I can do for you, then I'll go. But do you ask me?" Anthony replied. "I don't know. I may be forced to, not by him, but by my pride," she admitted, desperate. "Oh, I'm unstrung. I don't know what to say. After all, just the sound of a kind voice makes me a coward. God, if people in the world only knew the value of kindness. I never did know. This desert of horrors teaches the truth of life. Once I had the world at my feet. Now I break and bow at the sympathy of a stranger." "Never mind your pride," Anthony said coolly. "I understand. I have a good deal of a woman in me. Whatever brought you to Death Valley, whatever nails you here, is nothing to me. Even if I learn it, why should that matter to you? If you don't want me to stay to work for you, to watch over your husband, then let me stay for my own sake." She stood up and faced him, her eyes searching his soul. She couldn't escape her nature. Emotion governed her. "Sir, you speak nobly," she said, her lips trembling. "But I don't understand you. Stay here where I am for your sake. Explain, please." "I have my burden. Once it was even more terrible than yours. Through that I can feel as you feel now. I have lived the loneliness, the insupportable loneliness of the desert, the silence, the heat, the hell. The weight of my burden still lingers in my soul. If I could somehow assist your husband, who is heading down a dangerous path driven by passion, to change or stop him, it would ease my burden. If I could relieve you of weariness, physical pain, hunger, thirst, or terror, it would be doing more for myself than for you. We are currently in Death Valley, 200 feet below sea level. When the scorching heat of the furnace and the blasting midnight wind come, it means either madness or death. "Stay, Sir Knight," she said with a hollow, ringing gaiety. "Who can say that chivalry is dead? Stay and know this. I fear no man. I scorn death. But the woman in me. I hate dirt and vermin. I'm afraid of pain. I suffer agonies even before I'm hurt. I miss the luxuries of life so unforgettably. And lastly, I have a mortal terror of going mad. Spare me that, and you will have my prayers in this world and beyond. Good night." "Good night," I replied. She left me to the deepening gloom and the dying campfire. Soon I became aware of extreme fatigue in my mind and body. I spread my blankets on the sands, stretched my weary, aching body without even looking up at the stars, and fell asleep. Daylight arrived again as if by the opening of eyelids. The rose color vied with the blue of the sky, and a noble gold crowned the line of the eastern range, which I could see through the V-shaped split that opened into the valley. I put on my boots and gave my face an unusual and detrimental luxury in the desert. Water was bad for exposed flesh in arid country. The usual spring and buoyancy of my physical being was lacking this day. Yesterday's overstrain would require time to be remedied, so I moved slowly and with caution. First I went to the spring. A gush of water bubbled out of a hole and ran a few yards before seeping into the sand. The water looked inviting with its clear and soft appearance, and the sound of its murmur was melodious. Anthony was well versed in different types of water, having wandered the desert for years. Despite its promise, he knew this water was not good before he tasted it. It didn't have an unpleasant taste, but it wasn't exactly pleasant either. Dismukes had claimed the water was all right, but he never stayed in one place long enough to learn of its ill effects. Anthony knew he could drink this water and survive, but he was more concerned about the delicate woman lost in Death Valley with her idiot or knave of a husband. The spring was located around 200 yards away from the shack, just out of line of the rock-strewn slope. The weathered slant of stones extended its long, curved length in the opposite direction, spreading out like a fan. Anthony decided to make this his permanent camp, or at least his sleeping place. He erected a shelter made of brush and canvas to provide shade and deposited his belongings underneath it. With that done, he returned to the shack to cook breakfast. The hut seemed lifeless, and he wondered if the man who built it had ever been a boy. Some men were so helpless and useless in the wild, where survival depended on manual labor, that they seemed foreign to the descendants of Americans. Anthony couldn't help but ponder about the man lying inside the shack, even though he tried to focus on the woman. He didn't like the situation and wondered what good his strong arm and desert-taught fierceness to survive would do. These two individuals had forsaken their natural instincts to survive, fight, reproduce, and contribute to society, instead succumbing to the vices of a selfish and sophisticated lifestyle. Anthony perceived the woman as a victim of a weak and immoral man. He leisurely prepared breakfast, taking longer than usual to complete tasks that he normally did quickly. A voice interrupted him, calling out, "Good morning, Sir Wansfell." The voice had a hint of mockery, yet was rich and wistful, with a low-pitched contralto tone that was full of music, pathos, and bitterness. It stirred something within Anthony, as if it was from a distant memory. He turned to see the woman, dressed in gray with a cord twisted around her waist. Her outfit was soft, clean, and fluffy, completely at odds with the crude shack and wild slope in the background. Yet it suited her delicate voice and fragile physique, setting her apart from the women he had encountered during his travels in the desert. She was a spark from the great world beyond, a thoroughbred who could have been saved by the desert years ago. "Good morning, Mrs. Veery," Anthony replied. "How are you, and did your husband awake?" "I slept better than I have in a long time," she said, "and I think I know why. Yes, Veery woke up. He's conscious and asked for water, but he's acting strange. I want you to take a look at him soon." "Yes, I will," Anthony promised. "And how are you feeling after yesterday's exertions?" she asked. "Not so spry," Anthony admitted with a smile. "But I'll be back to my normal self in a day or so. I think the air down in the valley affected me a bit. My lungs are sore. I think it would be more comfortable for you if we had breakfast in your kitchen. The sun is getting hot." "Indeed, yes. So you're telling me you're willing to do this camp work for me despite—" Anthony trailed off, his voice trailing off as he looked at the woman in front of him. "Yes," she replied firmly. "I'm not afraid of a little hard work." "I always oppose women," he admitted. "But that's only because they're so scarce on the desert. I'm not used to having them around." The woman looked at him, her expression softening. "Last night I was upset. I'm sorry I was ungracious. I truly appreciate your help." Anthony nodded. "That's good to hear. Now, will you help me carry in breakfast?" As they sat down to eat, Anthony couldn't help but feel like he was in a dream. This woman was so captivating with her subtle perfume and beautiful face. The desert was full of illusions and unrealities, but sitting across from her made it hard for him to believe in reality. She ate daintily, but with obvious hunger. Her gray gown draped gracefully around her as they ate at the uneven makeshift table. "Should we try to get Veery to eat?" she asked, motioning towards a canvas partition. Anthony hesitated. "On the desert, after a collapse, we have to be careful with food and water." "Will you at least look at him?" she pleaded. Together they moved the canvas aside and entered a larger room. Anthony quickly took in the window and the two narrow beds raised on brush cots. Veery lay on one of the beds, his face drawn and pale. Anthony couldn't tell if the lines on Veery's face were permanent or the result of the collapse in the valley, but he couldn't help but feel like the man's face was the reflection of a tortured soul. Despite the mustache hiding his mouth, his face betrayed him. He must have been handsome once, with his deep-set black eyes and straight nose. Anthony was sharp and focused as he sized up Veery, sensing the woman's intensity as if he had been studying her instead of her husband. Women were strange creatures, he thought to himself. How could it matter to her what opinion he formed of her husband? Anthony had been prejudiced against Veery, but he had held back judgment until he could see him for himself. For many years, Anthony had stared into the face of the desert. Outward appearances could not deceive him. As the cactus revealed its ruthless nature and the tiny inch-high flower bloomed in its perishable but imperative proof of beauty as well as life, the long flowing sands of the desert revealed the destructive design of the universe. In the same way, the face of any man was the image of his soul. Anthony recoiled instinctively, if not outwardly, at what he saw in Veery's face. "You're in pain?" Anthony asked Veery. "Yes," came the husky whisper, and Veery put a hand on his chest. "It's sore here," said Anthony, feeling Veery. "You've breathed poisoned air down in the valley. It acts like ether. You just lie quiet for a while. I'll take care of things around camp." "Thank you," whispered Veery. The woman followed Anthony outside and gazed earnestly up at him, unaware of herself, with her face closer than it had ever been to him and full in the sunlight. It struck Anthony that the difference between desert flowers and the faces of beautiful women was one of emotion. How much better to have the brief hour of an unconscious flower wasting its fragrance on the desert air. "He's ill, don't you think?" the woman asked. "No, but he recovers slowly. A man must have a perfect heart and powerful lungs to battle against the many perils in this country. But Veery will get over this all right," Anthony replied. "You never give up, do you?" the woman asked. "Come to think of that, I guess I never do," Anthony replied. "That kind of determination deserves a better cause," he said. "You're bound to fail here." "Well, I'm not perfect, that's for sure, but you never know," she replied. "The fact that I'm standing here is proof that I've overcome almost impossible things. I can't make Death Valley a paradise for you, but I can make it easier. How long have you been here?" "Several months. Feels like years," she replied. "Who brought you here? How did you get here?" he asked. "We had different guides. The last were Shoshone Indians. They took us across mountains, a valley, and over the Panamints. They left us here. I rode a horse. Veery walked the last part. We let the horse and burros go. I haven't seen them since." "Do the Shoshones come to visit you?" he inquired. "Yes, Veery made a deal with them to come every full moon. We have more supplies than we need. The problem is that Veery eats too much, and I don't know how to cook in these conditions. We almost starved." "Let me take care of camp duties. You take care of your husband and yourself. You'll face enough hardship and suffering even in the best circumstances. I can see you've suffered, but not physically. You didn't know what hardship was until you got here. These things will cure you of any trouble. They'll hardly cure Veery, though. Most men in the desert give up and sink, but you won't. And let me tell you, there are elemental pangs of hunger, thirst, and pain that are blessings in disguise. You'll learn what rest, sleep, and loneliness are. People who live like you do are one-sided. They don't know what it's like to be close to the earth. Any other life is a lie. The hustle and bustle of cities, with their wealth, poverty, and luxury, were never a part of nature's plan. Mrs. Veery believed that if anything could change her soul, it would be the desert. Sir Wansfeld responded with a philosophical approach, and Mrs. Veery mocked herself, saying that she was a woman symbolizing change. She wanted to learn how to cook, work, grow strong, endure, fight, and look up at the dark hills where Sir Wansfeld's strength came from. She was in Death Valley and intended to stay there until her bones turned to dust. However, she wanted her soul, filled with doubt, agony, terror, and hate, to change if possible. Anthony was captivated by Mrs. Veery's tragic and eloquent words, and they kept him rooted in Death Valley. Work and action had become second nature to him, and he began planning to build a brush shelter from the sun, an outside room adjoining the shack, a stone fireplace, tables, seats, a low stone wall to keep out blowing sand, and a thick, heavy stone fence between the shack and the slope of sliding rocks. He knew that idleness in Death Valley could lead to madness, and there must be a reserve fund of long work and exercise to combat it. The men who succumbed to madness were those who did not know how to fight it. The day passed quickly, and the twilight hour seemed less gloomy and forbidding. Due to his unwavering optimism, Veery seemed to have improved. Mrs. Veery appeared less solemn and did not speak with any bitterness or anger. She updated Anthony on Veery's condition, and after 2 more days passed, Veery emerged from his tent and stepped into the sunlight. Anthony was working nearby and watched as Veery surveyed the improvements that had been made and commented on them to his wife. Despite his haggard appearance, he seemed like a man in his prime. As Veery approached him with a slow gait, Anthony noticed the mocking glint in Mrs. Veery's eyes and the doubt and curiosity on her face. He realized that any hopes of a cordial relationship with Veery were futile. "Do you expect payment for this work?" Veery asked, his tone confrontational. "No," Anthony replied curtly. "How come?" "Well, when men are accustomed to the desert like I am, they lend a hand when needed. But that's not often. But I didn't ask for any work to be done around my camp. I know, and I'll excuse you because you're not familiar with the ways and necessities of the desert." Veery bristled at the suggestion of needing an excuse. Anthony rose to his full height, fixing his piercing gaze on Veery. Mrs. Veery stood slightly to the side, but still within Anthony's range of vision. "We all need to be excused at times," Anthony said deliberately. "I had to excuse you for your ignorance of the desert. You chose to camp in the most dangerous spot I've ever seen. At any moment a rock could roll down and kill you. That slope is an avalanche waiting to happen." "It's my business where I camp," Veery retorted. "Are you aware of the danger here?" asked Veery. "I don't really care about danger," replied Anthony. "But you have a woman with you," pointed out Veery. It was clear that Veery hadn't thought through his words and was looking at Anthony without truly seeing him. Suddenly the brooding shade disappeared from Veery's eyes, replaced by a keen interest that shone with crystal-clear clarity. "You're a prospector," he stated. "No, I just pan for gold dust occasionally for fun," answered Anthony. "You're not a miner hunter or teamster, then," observed Veery. "I've done a bit of everything, but I wouldn't say I'm any one of those," said Anthony. "You might be one of the robbers that haunt these hills," accused Veery. "I could be, but I'm not," replied Anthony dryly. Though he felt a fire stirring within him, he kept it under control. He didn't want to be harsh with this unfortunate man. If only the woman wasn't standing there, doubting him with her half-veiled, mocking gaze. "You're an educated man," exclaimed Veery in disbelief. "I could claim to be specially educated in the ways of the desert," said Anthony with a touch of humor. "And what about the ways of women? Are they a mystery to you?" sneered Veery. His question seemed to come from a deep well of bitterness and doubt. "I confess they are," admitted Anthony. "I've lived a lonely life, and few women have crossed my path." "You don't know how lucky you are if you're telling the truth," said Veery. "I wouldn't lie to anyone," retorted Anthony bluntly. "Bah! Men are all liars, and women make them that way," spat Veery. "You're just hanging around my camp pretending to work." "That's not true," protested Anthony. "Lifting these stones is hard work, and I've carried you on my back for 10 miles over the floor of Death Valley. Was that a bluff?" "You saved my life," exclaimed Veery, his emotions getting the better of him. There was a war within him, a battle between old ways of thinking and a new overwhelming negativity. "Man, I can't thank you for that. You've done me no favors," he said. "I don't want or expect thanks. I was thinking of the effort it took," Anthony replied. "As a man who was once a gentleman, I do thank you. It's a courtesy due to my past. But now that you've put me in debt for a service I didn't want, why do you linger here?" "I wish to help your wife," Anthony said. "Ah, that's frank of you. I appreciate your honesty. But forgive me if I'm skeptical of your idealistic motives," the man replied. Anthony thought about the man's words but didn't respond. He was more concerned with the bitterness in the man's tone than the meaning behind his words. As he looked into Magdalene Veery's eyes, he felt inspired to reveal the man's veiled hint and to approach the situation with kindness. "Go ahead and help her," Veery said. "I sincerely congratulate you. My wife is helpless, and I never knew how much until we were on our own. She can't even cook a potato or bake bread. If you eat her bread, I won't be bothered by your attention to her." "I'll teach her," Anthony said practically. His response irritated Veery, who felt insulted and provoked. "Who are you?" "What's your name?" he asked. "Wansfell," Anthony replied. "Wansfell?" Veery repeated, struck by the name. It sparked a memory, but not a pleasant one. "Wansfell, I know that name." "Are you Wansfell the Wanderer?" asked Veery, his tired face now brightening with recognition. "Yeah, that's me," replied Wansfell. "I heard a story about you from a prospector at a camp near a gold mine," said Veery. "He said you killed a man named Baldy McHugh. Did he tell the truth?" "Yeah, unfortunately," replied Wansfell. "I was the one who ended up killing him, or rather the desert did what was justly due to him." Veery was now excited, his demeanor changing completely. "That story haunted me," he said. "I've never heard anything like it. The prospector said you confronted McHugh in the street in front of a gambling hall or hotel. You yelled at him and he started shooting, but none of the bullets hit you. You jumped on him, his gun and hat went flying, and then you killed him with your bare hands. Is that true?" Wansfell nodded solemnly. He didn't like reliving the memory, and the woman who had been standing there the whole time looked horrified. "You killed him with your bare hands?" she asked, her face white with shock. "Yes, I did," replied Wansfell. "Why did you kill him?" asked Veery, his wonder now mixed with suspicion. "He was mistreating a woman," replied Wansfell, turning away from them. Veery drew back, his lips stiffening. "So you killed him over a woman?" he asked. Wansfell didn't want to reveal his true thoughts, so he remained silent. He had a feeling that this conversation was far from over. As he stood there, Anthony couldn't help but notice the millions of rocks resting on the endless slope. It seemed as though they were ready to plunge down at any moment. Suddenly he heard a quick, sharp breath and felt the presence of someone stepping back. There was a silence that followed. It was Veery. "So that was it," Veery said, making an effort to speak. "I always wondered. It's like a Wild West story, you know. Strange that I should meet you. Thanks for telling me. I gather it wasn't pleasant for you." "It's sickening to recall, but I have no regrets," Anthony replied. "Quite so, I understand." "You're a man of the desert, ruthless and inhuman," Veery said. "Inhuman?" Anthony asked, stung. He looked at Veery and saw a conscience in tumult, a spirit for the moment terrorized. "Veery, you and I would never agree on meanings of words. I broke McHugh's arms, ribs, and legs, and while I cracked them, I told him what an inhuman dastard he had been to ruin a girl, to beat her, to abandon her and her baby, to leave them to die. I told him how I had watched them die. Then I broke his neck. McHugh was the inhuman man, not I." Veery turned away and swayed a little. His white hand, like a woman's, sought the stone wall for support until he reached the shack, which he entered. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Veery, that story had to come up," Anthony said, confronting her reluctantly. But she surprised him again. He expected to find her sickened, shrinking from him as a bloody monster, perhaps half fainting. Instead, he found that she seemed serene, controlling deep emotions which manifested themselves only in the marble whiteness of her cheek and the strained darkness of her eye. "The story was beautiful. I had not heard it," she said, and the rich tremor of her voice thrilled Anthony. "What woman would not revel in such a story? Wansfell the Wanderer. It should be Sir Wansfell, Knight of the Desert." "Why are you staring at me like that? Haven't you learned that the greatest thing a man can do is fight for the honor, love, happiness, or life of a woman? I am that woman. Many men have loved me, but Veery's love is so strong that it borders on hate. However, no man has ever truly seen me, heard the songs that echoed through my soul, or fought to save me. My friend, I speak to you honestly, like the wilderness that surrounds us. I just watched my husband and listened to his words as if they were new to me. I also watched you and listened to you, and now I must tell you that if you come to fight my battles, it will add to my already long list of troubles. It will be like awakening a blind woman to a new reality, facing my soul, and perhaps finding salvation. It will be a crowning agony and a glory that comes too late." Chapter 16. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Anthony took charge of cooking the Veery's supper. He waited until they had finished before satisfying his own hunger. Veery was in high spirits, even cracking jokes about the first decent meal he had eaten on the desert. His wife was calm and collected, occasionally delivering subtle jabs as if she had never hinted at the danger that threatened her heart. It was their way of masking their true feelings when they saw fit. But Anthony remained silent. He retreated to the shadow of the towering gate to the valley, lost in thought. Gradually, the stars and the peaceful silence cleared his mind. He found himself in the midst of the most peculiar and perilous situation he had ever encountered in all his years on the desert. But was it really just a coincidence? He had traveled straight through the barren land to meet a woman he was certain would love him, and a man he was determined to kill. This feeling of fate was overwhelming and seemed to surround him wherever he went. His mind couldn't comprehend it, and he questioned whether he had been in Death Valley for days or months. It all felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The desert was a faithful companion, always answering his questions. This was simply the ebb and flow of human passion, the struggle between man and woman that could bring both joy and terror. Death Valley lay before him, unchanging and ominous, a silent witness to the tragedy unfolding. Veery had brought his wife to this desolate place to punish her for some imagined wrong, to isolate her from the world and revel in her misery. He wanted to possess her completely, but his love had turned to hate, and he would watch her suffer until the end. Death Valley was the perfect setting for this tragedy, a fitting grave for those involved. Anthony couldn't understand Magdalene Veery, but he thought about her constantly, trying to unravel the mystery that surrounded her. Women were always a mystery to Anthony. The memory of Amy Aralanes, a Mexican girl with dark eyes and no mind or soul, flashed into his mind. But he quickly pushed it aside, feeling like it was sacrilege to associate her with Magdalene Veery. Veery was complex and had a mind, passion, nobility, and soul. Anthony couldn't understand why her husband hated her so much. He knew she never loved him and never loved another man with the same passion and spirit of her wonderful womanhood. He could feel the intensity of her emotions and knew that she had wronged her husband terribly, but didn't know how. Anthony had no interest in what had driven them to this point, but he couldn't help feeling an unutterable pity for Magdalene Veery. He couldn't love her as a man, but as a brother he yearned to change her and save her. He believed that helping others was what made life worth living, especially for women in trouble. He saw the tragedy of Magdalene Viré and hated the certainty of her physical pain, the turgid pulse, the red-hot iron band at the temples, the bearing down of weighted air and the drying up of flesh and blood. But more than anything, he hated the thought of her spirit dying while her body lived in a land where death reigned. Before Viré's hands were stained with her blood, there would be a murder without bloodshed. The thought gave Anthony pause. Was he dealing with a personality beyond his power to understand? He knew nothing about this mysterious woman, but he felt everything. She was beautiful, captivating, secretive, distant, and proud, as magnificent as a blazing flame. She was mocking because she had an open book of knowledge about the world, the frailty of women, and the falsity of men. She had lived within sight of busy streets and public places where people passed by without knowing anything about the earth except that it was a place for graves. She was bitter because she had tasted the bitterness of life to the full. But the sudden warmth that flashed out of her, breaking through her reserve, came from a heart of golden fire. Anthony placed himself as an all-knowing judge, responsible only to his conscience. He would always be true to the truth about this woman by all the gods. The thought that she had willingly entered this desert of desolation seemed to be far away in the past. Had Death Valley, with its reputation for death, any terrors for her? She had come willingly next to her husband, whom she despised beyond measure, infinitely brave where he was cowardly and scornful and magnificent, ready to face any punishment that might satisfy him. Anthony saw how Magdalene Viré was responding to some strange need within herself. Let the blind, weak, egoistic Viré demand the tortures of the damned. She would pay, but she was also paying a debt to herself. Anthony's final impression of Magdalene Viré was that she had been terribly mistreated by life and by men. He believed that when she was younger she had rebelled against the selfish laws of husbands, and in her later years, after experiencing the storm and defeat of womanhood, she had risen to the challenge and remained true to herself. She had faced the desert with a sense of mockery towards the man who thought he could make her weak and guilty. She had seen love turn into hate and had divined the hidden motive behind it. She had even welcomed Death Valley. Anthony was amazed by her unbreakable spirit and sublime audacity. He hesitated to try and turn her from her indifferent nature, but the idea of embodying the instinct, strife, and nature of the desert in her thrilled him. He believed that if he had the power to teach her, she could grasp the lesson in a single day. He was also intrigued by her unforgettable implication of the crowning agony of what he might bring upon her. He interpreted it as love, but only with wonder and pity. The idea consumed Anthony's imagination. He believed that such love could come to pass, as the desert was a place of violence where the elements did not wait upon time or circumstance. He had encountered few women on the desert, but even the hideous and unsexed Mojave Joe had fallen in love with him. Anthony had never desired the love of any woman since his youth on the desert, where Amy, with her dusky eyes, had whispered sweet words of love to him. He couldn't help but think back to that moment, so long ago and far away. He certainly didn't want the love of Magdalene Viré least of all. If only she were young and I were young, or if she had never— He trailed off. Even the thought of what could have been was a useless dream, but he had already made his choice. He would serve Magdalene Viré and teach her the secrets of the sand wastes and the lonely hills, teaching her that the victory of life was in not giving up. He would fight for her, too, in any way he knew how. He would fight against the solitude and loneliness of Death Valley, the heat, thirst, starvation, poison air, furnace wind, storm, flood, and avalanche. And if it came down to it, he would use his ruthless might to protect her from anyone who dared to harm her. The next morning, Anthony arrived at the Viré camp at sunrise and was met by a transformed Mrs. Viré. She was dressed in a riding suit which had seen better days due to the rough ride across the mountain. But it made a remarkable difference in her appearance, making her appear less tall. Her slenderness was revealed, showing off her graceful and symmetrical figure. She had braided her hair and let it hang down. Once the sun had tanned her white face and hands, Magdalene Viré would be truly transformed. Anthony tried not to stare, but it was impossible. "Good morning," she said with a bright smile. "Why, Mrs. Viré, I hardly knew you," he stammered. "Thanks, I feel complimented. It is the first time you've looked at me," she replied. "Stripped of my worldly possessions, do I start off well, desert man? No more suffocating dresses weighing me down, no more veils to shield my face. Let the sun scorch me. I want to work. I want to assist. I want to learn. If I must be crazy, let it be a madness to discover what made you the man you are in this forsaken land. There, Sir Wansfell, I have thrown down the gauntlet." "Very well," answered Anthony seriously. "And now," she continued, "I am eager to work. If I make mistakes, be patient. If I am clueless, enlighten me. And if I collapse in the sun or tumble beside the trail, remember it is my frail body that fails, not my determination." So in light of her fervent interest, Anthony found the mundane task of kneading dough and baking bread to be a source of pleasure and a teaching moment. "Ah, how essential the simple things in life are," she exclaimed. "A poet once said, 'We live too much in the world.' I wonder if he meant precisely this. We grow apart from or never learn the basic things. I recall my grandfather's farm, the plowed fields, the green corn, the yellow wheat, the chickens in the garden, the mice in the barn, the smell of hay, the smell of burning leaves, the smell of the rich brown earth. Wansfell, I haven't thought of them in years. Something about the way you worked on that bread like a sweet old country lady brought it all back. Oh, I wonder what else I have missed." "We all miss something. It's inevitable. But there are compensations, and it's never too late. You are a child despite your size. You have the mind of a child. That's one of my few blessings. Now it's your turn to try your hand at mixing the second batch of dough," she said as she knelt down and rolled up her sleeves. Her hands, once delicate and beautiful, were now white with flour, and her face began to flush with effort. Anthony couldn't help but chuckle at her inability to mix the dough properly, but at the same time he felt a deep sadness for her earnestness and the pathos of her situation. Eventually they managed to prepare the meal, and she carried Veery's breakfast in to him. Then she returned to eat with Anthony. "I'll wash the dishes," she announced. "No," he protested, but they ended up compromising. It was during this clash that Anthony realized he could dominate her in small matters, but in a great conflict of wills she would be the stronger. It was a lesson in his own slow education. There was a constitutional difference between men and women. As Anthony resumed his work around the shack, Mrs. Veery helped him as much as he would permit, but by midday it was beyond her strength. Her face was sunburned, and her hands showed the contact with dirt while her boots were dusty. "You mustn't overdo it," he advised. "Rest and sleep during the noon hours." She retired within the shack and didn't reappear until the middle of the afternoon. Meanwhile, Anthony had worked at his tasks, trying to keep an eye on Veery, who wandered aimlessly around the rock-strewn field. He saw how Veery watched the shack, and when Magdalene came out again he grew as motionless as the stone where he leaned. Every thought of Veery's must have been dominated by this woman's presence, the meaning of her, the possibilities of her, and the tragedy of her. "Oh, how I slept!" she exclaimed. "Is it work that makes you sleep?" "Indeed, yes." "Ah, I see my noble husband standing like Mephistopheles, smiling at grief." "What's he doing over there?" asked Mrs. Veery, nodding towards a man who had been lurking in the area for hours. "I don't know. Maybe he's watching for you," replied Anthony. "Poor man," Mrs. Veery said with both compassion and mockery. "Watching me? What a waste of time. It's a habit he's had for years." Mrs. Veery then requested to be taken down to the opening in the mountain so she could look into Death Valley. Anthony hesitated, asking if he should ask the man if he wanted to come along. However, Mrs. Veery refused, stating that the man was nothing to her and that they were as far apart as the poles. As they made their way down the gentle slope, Anthony stopped to pick some tiny flowers that were barely visible among the sun-blasted shrubs. Mrs. Veery was amazed that there were flowers in Death Valley. Anthony explained that the flowers bloomed for only a day before withering and dying. He saw their blossoming as a wonder of the desert and perhaps even a promise. The tiny seeds lay in hot sands for a year before a mysterious call prompted them to shoot up an inch-long stalk towards the sun. Then, in just a few short days, they would bloom and die. "They may be flowers of a day, but they have beauty and fragrance," Mrs. Veery mused. "I've never seen anything like them before." Anthony led his companion to the base of the mountain wall and around the corner of the opening, so that they came suddenly and unexpectedly into full view of Death Valley. He didn't look at her, wanting to wait a little before doing that. The soft gasp that escaped her lips and the quick grasping of his hand were significant of the shock she sustained. Their position faced mostly down the valley. It seemed a vast level, gently sloping up to the borders where spots of mesquite dotted the sand. Dull gray and flat, these league-wide wastes of speckled sand bordered a dazzling white sunlit belt, the winding bottom of the long bowl, the salty dead stream of Death Valley. Miles and miles below, two mountain ranges blended in a purple blaze, and endless slanting lines of slopes ran down to merge in the valley floor. The ranges sent down offshoots of mountains that slanted and lengthened into the valley. One bright green oasis that, lost in the vastness, was comparable to one of the tiny flowers Anthony had plucked out of the sand, shone wonderfully and elusively out of the glare of gray and white, a dim, mystic scene. "Oh God, it is my grave!" cried Magdalene Viré. "We all are destined for graves," replied Anthony solemnly. "Could any grave elsewhere be so grand, so lonely, so peaceful? Now let us walk out a little way to the edge of that ridge and sit there while the sun sets." On this vantage point they were out some distance in the valley so that they could even see the western end of the Panamint Range, where a glaring sun had begun to change its color over the bold black peaks. A broad shadow lengthened across the valley and crept up the yellow foothills to the red Funeral Mountains. This shadow marvelously changed to purple, and as the radiance of light continued to shade, the purple deepened. They indeed give rise to thoughts too deep for tears. As Anthony gazed out over the valley, he couldn't help but notice the hazy blanket that hung over the western horizon. The sun was sinking fast, and he could feel the heat dissipating as the day began to wind down. The sky was awash with gold and silver hues, and Anthony was determined not to miss a single moment of the transformation. His companion stood silently beside him, equally captivated by the beauty of the scene before them. Across the valley the funerals loomed large, their jagged peaks crowned with a rosy glow. The only dome-shaped peak in sight showed off its strata of gray and drab through the rose-colored haze. Further back, a pink shaft of light shot up into the blue sky, a stark contrast to the pearl-gray hills and slopes below. But as quickly as the colors had appeared, they began to fade away, leaving behind a somber, smoky sunset that seemed to hint at the gateway of hell. Anthony watched as a vulture soared across the sky, adding a small touch of life to the desolate landscape. The day was done, and the shadows of the desert began to creep in. The moment was tranquil, yet tinged with sadness. It was a reminder that man was merely a visitor in this harsh and unforgiving land, an accident of evolution or the will of God that had placed him where he was never meant to be. Death Valley was a rugged tear in the fabric of the earth, a place where men wandered lost and brooding, or else feverishly sought after the elusive treasures hidden within its depths. And as the mysterious lights of the valley flickered and changed, Anthony couldn't help but wonder what other secrets lay hidden within its rugged terrain. A long, pale glow stretched across the western horizon, casting a solemn stillness over the land. The only remaining hint of color was a dim red far to the south. Anthony broke the silence, addressing Magdalene Viré. "What you see there might resemble death, but it's really peace. Doesn't it calm your troubled soul? Here, a woman can be herself." Magdalene, known for her eloquence, remained silent. Anthony gazed into her shadowed eyes, and what he saw left him awed. The abyss he glimpsed through those windows of her soul was like the gray, scored valley below. But it was alive, quickening with thought, hope, and life. Death Valley may have been dying, but this woman's spirit seemed everlasting. If her soul had been a whited sepulchre, it was in the process of transfiguration. In that moment, Anthony felt a singular exaltation, a joy beyond his comprehension. He sensed that this strange communion between Magdalene's awakening and the terrible lessons of his life was creating a far-off interest, baffling yet inspiring. As twilight fell, he led her back to camp, content in her continued silence. But the touch of her hand as they parted spoke more eloquently than words. Alone in his blankets, Anthony gazed up at the inscrutable stars, lost in thought. Behind his musings thrummed a divine hope that he could save Magdalene's life, her soul, and perhaps even her happiness. The next day his natural aggressiveness asserted itself, tempered by an unshakable spirit that nothing could defeat. Approaching Viré with kindness and good nature, Anthony began talking about the dangers of Death Valley. He spoke of the blasting heat, the horror of the midnight furnace winds, and the possibility of water drying up. Initially cold, Veery grew impatient, intolerant, and eventually furious. Anthony persisted in his arguments until Veery stormed off. Mrs. Veery overheard the clash and found Anthony's attempt to change her husband amusing. However, when Veery returned for supper, he was glad to eat. Anthony continued to argue, and Mrs. Veery listened intently as he explained why they needed to leave Death Valley before midsummer. Veery was uninterested, but Mrs. Veery was intrigued by Anthony. From then on, Anthony dedicated himself to teaching Magdalene Veery and wearing down Veery's will. He taught her all the lighter tasks of desert life and led her on walks and climbs that left her sunburnt, scalded, and bruised. As she grew stronger, he urged her to her limit, and she suffered extreme fatigue. Despite the challenges, Anthony taught her to recognize the illusion of distance and color, to watch the sunsets and stars, and to identify the rocks and vegetation. This singular time with Anthony was unmatched in all her desert experience. She learned the true meaning of physical pain and how to endure it. She also learned the importance of eating when she was famished, resting when she was exhausted, and sleeping when she needed peace. Anthony spent his days attacking Veery at every opportunity, which became limited to meal times. Veery often left camp to climb the dangerous slope of weathered rocks that fascinated him. He would perch on a large rock for hours, watching and waiting like a vulture. He slept during the day and through the night, but at dusk he would talk to Mrs. Veery in a low, passionate voice. Sometimes her mocking tone thrilled Anthony, but it also filled him with despair. Despite Veery's growing obsession with revenge, Anthony was convinced that he would eventually collapse and leave the valley. However, when the Indians came and Veery ordered supplies, Anthony had a grim thought. Well, I can always kill him. Despite his disgust for Veery, Anthony was captivated by Magdalene Veery. If the sunset over Death Valley had awakened her, the weeks that followed transformed her completely. Anthony couldn't express his feelings for the change in her. It gave him a newfound respect for the desert's harshness and solitude, and it provided him with a strange insight into the mysteries of life. Is it impossible to heal from disease or pain? Can a person's spirit not be renewed and their life not changed? Anthony believed that nothing was impossible when it came to human life. The desert was an incredible force that magnified and multiplied everything that could be felt: time, thought, effort, pain, health, and hope. To Anthony, it seemed as if he was changing Magdalene Veery's body, heart, and soul through their physical relation to the desert. Her face and hands had tanned, and her once slender body was slowly rounding out. If not for the sadness and mockery in her lips and shadowed eyes, she would be mistaken for a girl of 18. Her voice, with its rich contralto and subtle shades of tone, proclaimed her as a woman. Anthony had initially guessed her to be 30 years old, but as time passed and she grew younger with renewed strength, he changed his mind. He was certain of the reward and result of her inflexible will, splendid spirit, and sincere gladness. She had endured physical toil and pain until she was no longer frail, reviving her early love for natural things. Her heart was wholly absorbed in all that was possible to do in that lonesome fastness. With the genius and intuition of a woman, she had grasped at the one solace left to her: the possibility of learning Anthony's lesson of the desert. What had taken him years to acquire, she learned from him, or divined in days. She had a wonderful mind. Once, while resting on a promontory that overlooked the valley, Anthony spoke to her, but she did not hear him. Her eyes reflected the wonder and immensity of the waste beneath her. Magdalene Veery seemed lost in thought, and Anthony's voice broke through her reverie, startling her. He asked what she was thinking about, and she replied that she had no thoughts, that she had forgotten where she was, and that his voice had seemed far away. Anthony mentioned that he had spoken to her earlier, but she hadn't heard him because she had been so watchful. Magdalene acknowledged that she had been watchful, but she couldn't remember why. She wondered if it was happiness that she had felt. Wansfell replied that he had experienced many happy moments, but they were conscious ones, unlike the one Magdalene had just had. He couldn't recall what had caused her happiness, and she was unable to put it into words. Anthony suggested that he could put a thought in her mind, and he began to talk about the desert. He and Dismukes had once discussed why men were fascinated with the desert. They agreed that the commonly accepted idea of the desert's lure was wrong. Men didn't seek the desert for gold, solitude, or forgetfulness. Some wandered for the love of wandering, and others sought to hide from the world. Criminals are sent to the desert, but it's not just them who are drawn to it. Travelers crossing the desert talk about its enchantments, each with their own reasons: loneliness, peace, silence, beauty, wonder, sublimity, 1,000 reasons. All of them are proof of the strange call of the desert, but they don't go deep enough. "Have you solved the secret?" she asked wonderingly. "No, not yet," he replied a little sadly. "It eludes me. It's like finding the water of the mirage. It's like the secret of a woman's heart, Wansfell." "Then tell me," he said. "Ah, no woman ever tells that secret." "Have you come to love the desert?" "You ask me that often," she replied, perplexed. "I don't know. I revere it, I fear it, I thrill at its mystery. But love? I can't say that I love the desert, not yet. Love comes slowly and seldom to me. I loved my mother. Once I loved a horse." "Have you loved men?" he asked. "No," she flashed, suddenly passionate, her eyes burning dark on his. "Do you imagine that of me? I was 18 when they married me to Vyri. I despised him. I learned to loathe him. Wansfell, I never really loved any man. Once I was driven mad." Anthony could easily stir her emotions and make her speak passionately. His power to do this haunted him, and sometimes he couldn't resist it until wistfulness or trouble in her eyes made him ashamed. "Someday I'll tell you how I was ruined once," he said. "Ruined? You? Why, Wansfell, you're a man. Sometimes I think you're a god of the desert. But tell me, what do you mean by your lack of power to love?" "Lack? How little you know me. I am all power to love. I am a quivering mass of exquisitely delicate, sensitive nerves. I am a seething torrent of hot blood. I am a vast emptiness, as deep and terrible as this valley, yearning for love like it thirsts for precious rain or dew. My emotions are boundless, like the heaving tides of the sea. Love consumes me entirely." "And I'm just a foolish blunderer," Anthony replied. "Sometimes you wield a knife without mercy. Wansfell, listen. I have a child, a beautiful girl. She's 14 years old and the sweetest thing. Before she was born I didn't love her, I didn't want her. But afterwards, Wansfell, a mother's love is divine. But I had more than that. All of my heart went out to Ruth. Love, oh my God, does any man know the agony of love? Oh, I know. I had to leave her, I had to give her up, and I'll never see her again." The woman bowed with her hands to her face, and her slender body shook with sobs. "Forgive me," whispered Anthony huskily, feeling distressed. It was all he could say for a moment. She had stunned him. He had never imagined her as a mother. Yet I'm glad I know now. You should have told me. I am your friend. I've tried to be a brother. Tell me, Magdalene. You'll be less troubled. I will help you. I think I understand just a little. You seem to me only a very young woman, and you're a mother. I always say I'll never be surprised again, but the future is always full of surprises. And your little girl's name is Ruth? Ruth Vyri. What a lovely name." Anthony rambled on, full of contrition, hating himself, trying to convey sympathy. Perhaps his words, his touch on her bowed shoulder, helped her somewhat, for presently she sat up, flung back her hair, and turned a tear-stained face to him. How changed, how softened, how beautiful. Slowly her eyes were veiling an emotion, a glimpse of which uplifted him. "Wansfell, I'm 38 years old," she said. "Wow, that's unbelievable," he exclaimed. "Are you serious?" "Absolutely," she replied. Well, I guess I'll get back to trying to figure out this desert. But speaking of age, can you guess mine? I bet you'll never get it right." She studied him intently and then regained her composure. "You're a mystery. Those deep lines from your cheek to your jaw indicate pain, but not necessarily age. However, you do have some gray hair at your temples. I'd say you're around 37, maybe even 40. "Magdalene Vyri," he cried out in shock. "Do I really look that old? Oh, how time flies. I'm actually only 26. She was equally surprised. "Well, I guess we should stick to other riddles besides love and age. They can be deceiving. Let's go." Chapter 17. Magdalene Vyri stirred something deep within Anthony when she spoke of her love for the solitude and tragedy of the Valley of Shadows known as Wansfell. She admired the fact that few men and even fewer women ventured there, leaving it as a place reserved for the wanderers of the wastelands, the unquenchable souls like Anthony who endure through the fight, the struggle, the search, and the discovery. Magdalene believed that lost souls like hers belonged in such a place where death was certain for most who stayed, and yet death was also a part of life. She had faced her own soul in the black, lonely watches of the desert nights, and she would endure any agony to change it, to make it as high and noble as the white cone of the mountain in the distance. The desert had a mysterious and inscrutable influence on Magdalene, but it also took a toll on her physical being, as if an invisible withering wind had blown upon a flower in the night. Anthony saw this with distress, but Magdalene laughed at the truth of it without mockery. Her laughter had a triumphant ring to it, and it was clear that Anthony didn't quite understand her. She had a subtlety of character that seemed to come from the desert itself, and she remained a mystery to him. Despite his constant urging, she refused to leave Death Valley, though she seemed to enjoy listening to his pleas. "What if I just packed up everything and carried you out of here?" he asked stubbornly. "I suppose I'd like you to carry me," she replied with a low laugh, "but you wouldn't get very far." "Why not?" he asked, intrigued. "Because I'd use my feminine wiles to make time stand still right here," she said, with a sweetness and charm that seemed to come from another era. "Time stand still?" Anthony repeated, trying to understand. "Magdalene, you're beyond me." "Yes, it seems that way sometimes. You'll never see me as the woman who's been spoiled by men." "I understand that," he said. "But I don't want to see you that way. I might not—" "You might not respect me," she interrupted. "Alas, but Wansfell, if I had met you when I was 18, I would never have been courted and loved and ruined by men. You don't understand that either." Anthony had long accepted that he didn't always understand her. She was a complex woman, and he was a simple man. But he had managed to win her over, to help her grow stronger and healthier in the desert. Now, as the early June days began to take their toll on her, he urged her to leave the valley. But she remained stubborn, parrying his arguments and threats with a subtle femininity that left him bewildered. As the seasons changed, the time for Mrs. Veery and Anthony to visit their favorite spot near the valley gateway became limited to early mornings or late afternoons. The sun's dominance during most of the day made it too hot to climb to the promontories. However, one morning before sunrise, Mrs. Veery convinced Anthony to take her to a high point where she could face the east. The climb was difficult, but they made it to the top just in time to witness the luminous and rosy dawn. As the sun rose, the beauty faded, and the light over Death Valley became too intense for human eyes. On their way down, they encountered a narrow ledge with loose stones that made it precarious to walk. Anthony cautioned Mrs. Veery and offered to help her, but she waved him on and followed him with her agile step. Unfortunately, she slipped off the trail and began sliding down a slope of loose rocks that could cause serious injury. Though she didn't scream, Anthony quickly reacted and grabbed her just as she was about to fall. Using his strength, he lifted her up and waded through the stream of sliding rocks. The only difficulty was his fear of slipping and falling with her. As he reached the firm ledge, he prepared to place her back on her feet. "Time stop here," she exclaimed, her voice filled with a mixture of jest and sorrow, mourning what could have been but never would be. She possessed the timeless charm of a woman who could not separate her identity and awareness of her gender from their traditional relationship with men. Anthony stopped abruptly as if he had been chained, and looked down at her where she lay with her head resting on his left elbow. His once pale complexion was now adorned with a smile. Her wide eyes, open to the sky, appeared to reflect the dark blue hue and enigmatic light of the sky. Anthony saw astonishment and reverence, which must have been directed at him but seemed implausible, as well as the shading of inexpressible emotions. "Put me down," she said. "Why did you say time stop here?" he asked as he set her back on her feet. "Do you recall when I told you how words, lines, and verses of the poets I used to adore come to mind so vividly out here? Sometimes I recite them, that's all." "I see. Everything I've ever read has come back to me here in the desert, as clear as the print on the page that I saw so many years ago. When I was a boy, I used to despise Sunday school, but now words from the Bible often come to mind. But are you telling me the whole truth? Why did you say time stop here when I was holding you in my arms?" "You're such a boy," she whispered, and her eyes sparkled with joy at the sight of him. "Wouldn't it be nice if time stood still? If the world disappeared and we could just stay like this forever? She asked. He looked at her and replied, It's beautiful, but not as beautiful as you standing there right now. You give me hope. She asked, Hope for what? For you, he said. Wansfell, you're the only man who could hold me and not see me as a woman, she said. You've told me that I have noble emotions and great thoughts, and I hope I do. But I am also a woman, and a woman is more than just her thoughts. We are creatures of feeling, and that's just the way it is. She continued, It would be beautiful for time to stand still if you were holding me in your arms forever. Not just for safety and protection, but for so much more. A woman's fate is to be loved, and to be loved by a man who is strong and gentle just for her. It's a terrible thing, but it's just the way it is. Reflecting now, with the understanding that has come to me in this quiet valley where thoughts are all-encompassing, I realize that the need for love, the desire to be loved, is the most powerful instinct in any woman. It is an innate characteristic, unchangeable like the shape of one's hand. It's a tragic fate for women, for education, independence, and a career may blind them to their true nature. However, a man, the right man, can provide life to a woman. Without him, the best parts of her wither away. This instinct, which I'm ashamed to admit has remained unsatisfied despite the many men who have loved me. When you rescued me from harm and held me in your arms, that instinct which I cannot control surged within me. For that moment, until you gazed at me, I hoped it would last forever. I yearned to remain in your strong embrace until the end of time. I longed for you to see only me, feel only me, hold only me, live only for me, and love me above all else on earth and in heaven. She stopped, her slim brown hands clutching her chest, her eyes straining as if attempting to see through the darkness to a distant light. Anthony could only stare at her, captivated by her helplessness. In moments like this, she taught him as much about the enigma of life as he had taught her about the desert's nature. Now the instinct has faded, she continued. Your indifference has chilled it. I observe it with intelligence now. And Wansfell, I pity women. I pity myself despite my liberated mind. I may control my actions, but not my instincts and emotions. I am bound. I am a woman. I am a creature of femininity. I'm not so different from the fierce she-cats, the she-lions, and any of the other she-animals that you've told me fight to survive down on your wild Colorado desert. It seems to me that this is the fate and doom of women. No wonder they fight for men, spit and hiss, squall and scratch and rend. It's a sad thing, seen from a woman's perspective. That great mass of women who cannot reason about their instincts or understand the springs of their emotions are happier. Too much knowledge is bad for my sex. Perhaps we have been wrongly educated. I am happier for what you have taught me. I can see myself now with pity instead of loathing. I am not to blame for what life has made me. There are no wicked women. They must be loved or they are lost. My friend, the divinity in human life is seen best in some lost woman like me, Magdalene Vire said. I can't follow you, protested Anthony. But to say you are a lost woman, that I won't listen to. I was a lost woman, interrupted Mrs. Vire, her voice rising out of the strong, sweet melody. I had my pride, and I defied the husband whose heart I broke and whose life I ruined. I scorned the punishment, the exile he meted out to me. That was because I was thoroughbred. But all the same I was lost to happiness, to hope, to effort, to repentance, to spiritual uplift. Death Valley will be my tomb, but there will be resurrection for me. It is you, Wansfell, you have been my salvation. You have the power. It has come from your strife and agony on the desert. It is beyond riches, beyond honor. It is the divine in you that seeks and finds the divine in unfortunates who cross your wandering trail. Anthony was rendered mute, and all he could offer was his hand. In silence he led her down the slope. On a hot afternoon, Anthony lounged in the shade of a makeshift shelter he had constructed near the Vire shack. He was intently observing a group of red ants, which caught the attention of Vire, who had descended from the slope. Vire approached and scrutinized Anthony's peculiar posture. "Are you searching for gold grains?" Vire asked sarcastically. "I'll lend you my magnifying glass." Anthony replied without looking up. "I'm observing these red ants." Vire bent over to see and then slowly straightened up. "Go to the ant, thou sluggard," he exclaimed, this time without sarcasm. "Vire, I'm not a sluggard," Anthony retorted. "You are the lazy one. I am a hard worker." "Wansfell, I wasn't referring to you," Vire said. There are things I dislike about you, but laziness is not one of them. I've never worked a day in my life. I inherited money which turned out to be a curse. I thought I could buy everything, including a wife, the big-eyed woman you devote your time and attention to, and I bought for myself the sweetness of the deadly nightshade flower, a marble statue chiseled in the beautiful curves of mocking love, a woman of chain lightning and hate. If I had lived like those red ants you're watching, through hard work and industry, I might not have one foot in my grave in Death Valley. There were rare moments when Veery displayed human virtues such as regret, comprehension, and intolerance. Nevertheless, every word he uttered had a bitter tinge. Had the divine part of him been destroyed forever, or was it a hidden spark that could only be ignited by the touch of the woman he had lost? Anthony pondered. Sometimes he felt sorry for Veery, but the feeling never lasted long. Anthony had a profound respect for the red ants that scurried about the desert. He found them more admirable than some people who claimed to be divine. He despised those who lived life without purpose. The desert taught him that nature was merciless towards those who were idle. The red ants had built their hill a short distance away from where Anthony was sheltering. A group of ants moved swiftly from their hill towards the campsite, seemingly without any load. Another group of ants, however, struggled under the weight of their burdens as they moved in the opposite direction. At first, Anthony thought they were carrying bits of bread or gravel. Upon closer inspection, he realized they were carrying round black and white globules which were several times larger than their own bodies. He soon discovered that these were ant eggs that the tribe was relocating to another hill. It was fascinating to watch them. The species of desert ants that Anthony observed could bite as fiercely as a scorpion. Their labor was tireless. The biggest challenge was to keep the eggs from slipping out of their jaws. These burdens fell out constantly and rolled away. Some ants attempted many times, using different methods to grasp the hard little globules. Once they had a good grip, they had to undertake work that made human labor seem insignificant. The ants made good progress over smooth, hard ground, but they struggled when they encountered a crust of earth, a pebble, or a small chip. They never tried to avoid the obstacle. Instead, they surmounted it. They pushed, lifted, and heaved, and sometimes even dragged their precious burden behind them. Other ants would roll down a small pitfall with their eggs instead of circling it to reach the anthill. They would tumble over and over until they reached the bottom, then begin the uphill journey on the other side. Despite the difficulties, they remained patient, tireless, and wonderful. Anthony had to abandon his thoughts about the ants working hard over their eggs. He realized that the black and white globules were actually maize seeds. The night before, Anthony's burrowed Jenny had come around camp until he gave her the last of the maize left in one of his packs. Jenny had accidentally spilled a lot of the maize in the sand, and the ants were carrying the seeds back to their home. Anthony was amazed by their strength and tireless endurance. He was struck by the fact that these ants never gave up, and failure was not a part of their instincts. They were able to perform extraordinary feats because the mighty life of nature was incredibly strong in them. After finishing his task and meditation, Anthony was surprised to find Mrs. Veery nearby, watching him intently. He decided to show her the hard-working red ants. She observed them closely for a while and exclaimed, "Wonderful little creatures! Watching them is one of the secrets of your desert knowledge. I can't compare these ants to men. They are far superior. They have order, purpose, and are perfect organizations to carry on their lives. They will work and live the descendants of this very tribe of ants long after the race of men has disappeared off the face of the earth." As mesmerizing as it was to watch the workers go about their tasks, there was something about seeing a man chop wood or take long strides up a hill that appealed to Anthony more. One night he was roused from his sleep by a fierce gale that had come in from the valley. It was warmer than any night wind he had ever felt before, and it made him uneasy. He thought of the furnace winds that had made Death Valley famous and wondered if this was a forerunner of something worse. The wind carried a low, hollow roar that sounded like a voice. Anthony sensed that it was trying to warn him of something. He resolved to talk to Veery about Magdalene again. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out to save her. She had refused to leave without her husband, and Anthony was at a loss as to how to get through to him. He had tried to persuade Veery with the patience of an ant, but he felt like he needed to be more forceful. The warm wind had robbed him of his sleep, and its departure left an eerie silence in its wake. It was a silence so profound that it made Anthony feel like he was the only living thing in the universe. He couldn't hear the rustle of bat wings or anything else. It was as if he were trapped in a sepulchre, waiting for something to happen. The air moved silently, as if made of shadows. It was a dead solitude, a terrible silence. A man and the earth in the wide spaces and wild places of the world as it was in the beginning. This could be the last lesson for a thinking man, the last development into either savage or God. Suddenly there was a throb in his heart or a ringing in his ear, a crack of a stone faint and far away, high on the heights. It was a lonely sound that made the lonely night feel real. Anthony was relieved, the tension in his body relaxed. He listened hopefully, longing to hear another break in the silence that was insupportable. As he listened, the desert moon, oval and orange-hued, sailed over the black brow of the mountain. It illuminated the valley in a radiance that did not seem of land or sea. The darkness of midnight gave way to orange shadows, mustering and shading, stranger than the fantastic shapes of dreams. Another ring of rock on rock and sharp rattle and roll on roll assured Anthony that the weathering gods of the mountain were not daunted by the silence and loneliness of Death Valley. They were working as ever, their task to level the mountain down to the level of the sea. The stern, immutable purpose seemed to vibrate in the ringing cracks and in the hollow reports. These sounds, in their evenness and perfect rhythm and lonely tone, established once more in Anthony's disturbed consciousness the nature of the place. Death Valley. The rolling of rocks dispelled phantasms. Then came a low, grating roar. The avalanche of endless broken rocks had slipped an inch. It left an ominous silence. Anthony stirred restlessly in his blankets. There was a woman in the lee of that tremendous sliding slope. She had a delicate frame, a magnificent spirit, and a heart of living flame. Every hour she spent sleeping or staring into the face of impending doom was one of great danger. Anthony felt trapped by her will. Just because she was fearless and beyond understanding, did that mean he should let her die? Anthony vowed to end this situation before nightfall. But when he thought of Magdalene Veery, his heart sank. Only through the fierce spirit of the desert could he overcome her and defeat the jailer who held her captive. But her spirit seemed to block his own, an unapproachable force that was greater than ferocity and beyond physical life. And so Anthony lay awake, listening to the sound of falling rocks, the clatter and crash, and then the settling. Then he heard something different, louder and harsher, the sound of a stone being displaced and falling with a force that was not its own. It did not settle. Heavy and large, it crashed down into the sand and bumped through the brush. Another stone was set in motion, bringing a low, sliding crash of many small rocks. Anthony sat up and turned his ear toward the slope. Another large stone banged down onto the sand. He heard it whiz by, hurtling through the air between his camp and the Veery's. If that stone had hit their shack. Anthony pulled on his boots and walked out a little way from his camp. The orange gloom was almost opaque, but it had a radiance that allowed him to see almost as well as if the full moon were shining. He heard more cracking and rolling of little rocks, and then the displacement of a heavy one, which convinced him that a burro was climbing the slope or a panther was prowling around camp. At any rate, the sound of the stones being displaced unnaturally jarred Anthony's sensitive ears. Hastening towards the Veery shack, he approached the side further from the slope and called out through the brush wall, "Mrs. Veery." "Yes, what do you need, Wansfell?" she replied immediately. She had been wide awake. "Have you heard the sliding rocks?" he asked. "Indeed I have. All through that strange wind roar and later," she replied. "You and Veery should get up and take your blankets out a ways where you won't be in danger. I think there's a burro or a panther up on the slope. You know how loose the stones are and how at the slightest touch they come sliding and rolling. I'll go up and scare the beast away." "Wansfell, you're mistaken," came the response with that old mockery that always hurt Anthony. "You shouldn't insult a burro, let alone a panther." "What?" asked Anthony, confused. "It's another kind of animal," she replied. But for that subtle mockery in her voice, Anthony would have thought the woman was out of her mind, or at least answering him in her sleep. "Mrs. Veery, please," he pleaded. "Wansfell, it's a sneaking coyote," she called out piercingly, and then let out a low laugh. Anthony was completely dumbfounded. "Coyote!" he exclaimed. "Yes, it's my husband, it's Veery. He found out the rolling rocks frightened me at night, so he climbs up there and rolls them, sees how close he can come to hitting the shack. Oh, he's done that often." For a moment Anthony leaned against the brush wall with his head bowed, as if turned to stone. Then, like a man stung, he leaped up and bounded around the shack towards the slope. In the orange radiance on that strange, moon-blanched slope, he dimly saw a moving object. It stood upright. It was definitely not a burrow or panther. Anthony drew a deep and mighty breath for the yell that must jar the very stones from their sockets. "Yar!" he yelled in a stentorian roar. The great sound pealed up the slope like thunder. "Come down or I'll strangle you!" Anthony yelled into the vast expanse of the desert, but only the echoes of his own voice answered him. The sound died away, leaving behind a deafening silence that seemed to suffocate him. The rest of the night was spent in pacing back and forth, trying to control the raging anger that threatened to consume him. He would have gladly killed Veery, just like he would have crushed a venomous snake under his foot. But there was something that held him back, a spirit that walked beside him in the shadows, as he looked up at the bleak mountains and the pale stars. He walked down to the gateway between the towering walls, where a faint light glowed in the distance. As he watched, a bright star rose above the horizon, illuminating the valley with a soft, ethereal light. It was as if the Star of Bethlehem had appeared before him, leading him on a path of redemption. He wondered what this miraculous sight could mean. Was it just another planet, like the Earth, basking in the light of the sun? He looked up at the star, his face drawn with emotion, struggling to overcome the darker impulses that threatened to overwhelm him. Magdalene Veery's face appeared before him, her pain and suffering echoing through his mind. He knew that if he killed her tormentor, he would be failing her in some way. The brutality of Veery's actions seemed to fade away as he struggled with his inner demons. "I won't kill him yet," he whispered to himself, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. As he made his way back to the camp, the sun had risen, casting a dull haze over the land. The air was still, and there was no sound to be heard except for the beating of his own heart. Magdalene Veery sat on a stone bench under a brush shelter waiting for him. As he approached, she stood up with a smile that was as genuine as her presence, but her eyes were darkened and her lips trembled with fear. Anthony could sense her fear, but it wasn't fear of him. It was fear of what he might do. "Is Veery back yet?" Anthony asked. "Yes, he just returned. He's inside, going to sleep," Magdalene replied. "I want to see him to get something off my mind," said Anthony. "Wait, Anthony!" Magdalene cried and reached for him as he turned to head toward the shack. One look at her stopped him in his tracks. He slowly sat down on the stone seat and bowed his head. This was one of the most poignant moments of his life, filled with pity for others. But he also felt admiration for Magdalene. She came close to him, leaned against him, and he could feel her body quivering with the need for support. She put a shaking hand on his shoulder and whispered, "My friend brother, if you kill him, it will undo all the good you've done for me." "You once told me that the grandest act of a man was to fight for the happiness and life of a woman," Anthony replied. "And haven't I fought for your happiness and life too? I would have died long ago. As for happiness, it has come out of my fight, my work, my effort to meet you on your heights. I have more happiness than I deserve, more than I ever hoped to attain. But if you kill Veery, all will have been in vain." "Why?" he asked. "Because it is I who ruined him," Magdalene replied in a low, deep voice that showed the force behind her words. "As men go in the world, he was a gentleman, a man of affairs, happy and carefree. When he met me, his life changed. He worshipped me. I couldn't love him, but it wasn't his fault. They made me marry him against my will. He worshipped me for years until the shock of my hatred sent him into despair and agony. It made him go mad. There's a fine line between love and hate." "What ruined him?" Anthony demanded. "Anthony, I have to confess something that's harder than anything I've ever faced. You're the man I should have met years ago. Do you understand? I need your respect, your faith in me. I have to confess my shame to save my husband's life." "I won't let you humiliate yourself to save him," Anthony said firmly. "I promise I won't kill Veery unless he harms you." "But he already has harmed me. He's hit me," Magdalene said urgently. "He'll harm me sooner or later. He's obsessed with making me suffer. That's why he's let us spend so much time together. He hoped to see you fall in love with me and me to love you so he could revel in my pain. But I'm beyond his reach now, unless you kill him. which would stain my hands with his blood and bring back my soul's doom. Magdalene, I swear I won't kill Veery unless he kills you, Anthony promised. Thank you, Magdalene whispered in gratitude. I was afraid of you, but somehow I also gloried in your look. Listen, my friend, I must hurry to my downfall. I must rid myself of my feminine instincts and seek redemption. I am sacrificing a potential paradise, for I am young and life is sweet. She wrapped her arm around his head and pulled him close to her chest. His heart pounded in his veins, echoing her own tortured heart. Ruth was not Veery's child, she whispered, her voice low but clear. I was only 19, a foolish and reckless girl. I thought I was in love, but it was only a temporary insanity that often plagues women. I kept the secret for years, but eventually I had to confess to Veery. It destroyed him. He lived only to make me suffer, threatening to reveal my secret to Ruth. I could not bear the thought of that. I would have preferred 1,000 deaths over that. So we fled west to the desert, and my father and Ruth followed us. They caught up with us in Sacramento, but I knew I could not risk Veery being near Ruth. He hated her as passionately as he had once loved her. So I sent Ruth away with my father, but she did not know it was goodbye forever. I did. And in my desperation I dared Veery to do his worst. I had ruined him, and I was willing to pay with every last drop of my bitter heart. We ventured into Death Valley, seeking the terror and desolation that Veery believed would be the closest thing to a hell on earth. It was here that he began subjecting me to dirt, vermin, thirst, hunger, and pain. The horror of it all still haunts me to this day, but even Death Valley failed to defeat us. You arrived, Wansfell, and that was when I finally began to believe in God. Anthony drew Magdalene close to him, his long arm wrapping around her trembling body. Finally she had confessed her secret, and it called to the depths of him. He felt the endless agony of woman in her cry, and it was a bitter one of doubt. Though she called him the instrument of her salvation, it was more than he had found. A fierce rage burned within him for her ruin. He longed to rise up like a lion and slay. Blood and death were the only things that could equalize the wrong. Yet amidst his fury, a still voice whispered to him that she had been miserable, and now she was at peace. She had been lost, and now she was saved. He could not ignore that fact. His passion for the desert halted there, and he had to go on alone to ponder over the wonder of this woman and what had transformed her. He had to remember her soul-moving words and learn if the love she intimated was a terrible truth, somewhere in the solitude and silence. As Anthony stood there with Magdalene Veery, he couldn't believe it was true. Her slender form shook, and he felt a strange new sensation. It was like a convulsive birth of emotions that he thought had died years ago. The memory of Amy Carlos with her dusky eyes and black hair came flooding back. It was like she had just tilted her head and said, "Ah, so long ago and far away." Anthony felt the need to share his own deeply hidden secret with Magdalene. He wanted to reveal the shame and remorse and agony that he had been carrying for so long. "I will tell you my story," he said, his words feeling like cruel blades at the closed portals of his heart. He began to speak huskily, halting often and breathing hard. The clammy sweat beaded on his brow as he spoke of his boyhood and his love for his brother Carl. He talked about their life in the old home, where everything seemed to be for Carl and nothing for him, not even the friendships of the girls. As he spoke, Magdalene's own agony was forgotten. Her body went from quivering to strung intensity, and the heaving of her bosom was no longer a long-drawn breath to relieve oppression. Anthony confessed his little tawdry, miserable romance with a vain Mexican girl, and his fall from grace. He spoke of the words that had disillusioned him and how it had all happened so long ago and far away. Magdalene's voice echoed in the room, rich and full of fury. "Oh, such a thing for a girl to say," she cried. "And Amy was the only woman you ever loved, ever knew that way?" "Yes," Anthony replied. "And she was the cause of your ruin?" "Indeed she was, poor child." "The damned hussy," Magdalene exclaimed passionately. "And you were only 18 years old? How I hate her." "And what about the man who won her fickle heart?" Anthony bowed his head like a tree in a storm. "He was my brother." "Oh, no," she exclaimed. "The boy you loved was your brother. Oh, it can't be true." "It is true. And Magdalene, I killed him." With a gasp, she wrapped her arms around him in a fierce, protective frenzy of tenderness. She pressed his face to her breast, hanging over him like a mother over her child. Oh, my God, how terrible! Your brother! And I thought my secret, my sin, my burden was so terrible. Oh, my heart bleeds for you. Wands fell, poor unhappy wanderer. Chapter 18. Finally, July had arrived after the seemingly never-ending scorching days of June. No sensible man dared to cross Death Valley during the daytime. Even in the darkness, the rugged slopes of the Panamints emitted a foreboding red hue. The valley was a hazy gray, with shadows swirling and heat waves rippling like transparent smoke. Beyond the vast eerie valley were the dull and yellowish slopes of the Funeral Mountains, extending upwards to the bronze walls and then to the lilac and purple peaks concealed by the hazy sky. The sun was a vast, limitless blaze with a bright white core that no one could gaze upon. The heat compelled Anthony to limit his activities. Although he did not suffer greatly, he felt its weakening effects. His blood seemed to always be boiling. In the early mornings and late evenings he prepared simple meals that were gradually consumed less and less by his companions and himself. During the midday hours he lay in the shade, sweating and weighed down by a drowsy sleep. The only relief from the unforgiving heat and the invisible scorching iron bars was the night. During most of the long hours of darkness, Anthony couldn't sleep. He either walked around in the darkness or sat in silence, waiting for something he couldn't name. He knew he was waiting for something, but the fear of what it might be grew stronger with each passing moment. As the summer heat intensified, Veery changed both physically and mentally. He became thinner, walked with hunched shoulders, and his tongue protruded slightly as he constantly panted. He ate less and slept less each day and ignored Anthony's demands and warnings about the dangers of the sun. Veery reveled in the challenges of Death Valley, and his suffering would have been less if he had taken precautions. He no longer wore a mask in front of Anthony and ignored him as if he didn't exist. If Anthony wanted to speak to Veery, he had to physically block his path and confront him. Veery was consumed by his hate, and it possessed him completely. His hatred was primitive, and his desire to destroy was restrained, making it infinitely cruel. When Anthony was absent from camp, Veery would climb up the slope and roll down rocks, seeming to lose his mind. When Anthony returned, Veery would come down the slope, wet and exhausted, a pitiful sight. Anthony had tried to reason with him, but Veery was beyond reason. He was afraid of Anthony's huge hands, and the sight of them would make him retreat to the shack sullenly. He made sure that Magdalene Veery was constantly aware of his downfall and that it was all her doing. The scorching summer days turned him into a haggard, unshaven, and hollow-eyed wreck. He appeared at mealtimes unkempt and miserable, a ghostly figure barely eating and glaring at his wife with accusing eyes. He reminded her of the cool, luxurious rooms they used to have, with fine linen, delicate china, and exquisite cuisine. He contrasted this with the heat, filth, and horror of Death Valley. Whenever he could, he would present himself to her in his tattered and soaked garments, his body emaciated, his nerves shot, his hands bloody and trembling, and his tongue hanging out. He delighted in seeing her recoil from him, as if to say, "Behold the ruin of Veery." But if his delight was to gloat over his own downfall, his greatest joy was to witness his wife's ruin. Day by day, Death Valley eroded Magdalene Veery's beauty, leaving her a mere shadow of her former self. It was evident that Death Valley was not meant for a woman, no matter how strong-willed she might be. The only thing that could survive here was the spirit that had shed all earthly trappings. Veery watched his wife like a cat playing with a mouse, relishing her slow decline. He seemed to take pleasure in squeezing every last drop of life out of her while keeping her alive if possible. His greatest bitterness was that he could not keep her hidden from the eyes of any man but himself, like Mephistopheles gloating over the soul of a lost woman. In the most desolate place on earth he had hidden her away. But it seemed that no matter where he went, another man was always ready to lay down his life for her. Veery couldn't control the situation, and it was the only truth he could grasp. The terrible tragedy of his hate was that it was not hate at all, but love. He would have devoured his wife like a cannibal, not out of hunger, but out of his passion to consume her, to make her his forever. He never thought of her soul, her mind, or her spirit, so he never understood how she escaped him, or her mocking scorn. But through his thick and heat-hazed brain, he must have known his powers to torture her were failing. The time came when he stopped confronting her like a scarecrow, stopped accusing her, and stopped reminding her of their past. He gave up his refinement of cruelty, which marked his further change and greater abasement. He reverted to instinct and became a savage in his hate. His hate found its outlet in primitive ways. Anthony saw all this and felt his blood boil, not just from the torrid heat of Death Valley. His great hands, so efficient and ruthless, seemed fettered. He muttered to the silence of the night, to the solemn hazed daylight, to the rocks that had souls, and to the invisible presence ever beside him. How long must I stand this? How long, how long? One afternoon, as he awoke late from a sweltering siesta, he heard Mrs. Veery scream. The cry startled him because she had never done that before. He ran to find her lying at the foot of the stone bench in a dead faint. The sun beat down on the barren land, the only sound the soft rustling of the dry grass. Anthony noticed a figure lying on the ground, motionless. As he approached, he saw it was Mrs. Veery, her face pale and gaunt. A tarantula crawled out of her dress, and Anthony quickly disposed of it. He tried to revive her with water and a damp cloth, and eventually she woke up. Mrs. Veery clung to him as he lifted her up and sat her on a nearby bench. She explained that she had a strong aversion to spiders and other creepy crawlies inherited from her mother. Suddenly they heard a noise behind them, and Anthony turned to see Veery sneaking up on them. Without turning around, I could feel the man approaching me. Suddenly he held 2 sticks with a tarantula dangling in front of my face. I let out a blood-curdling scream and felt frozen in place. The man then dropped the spider onto my lap and everything went black. Anthony asked, "Where is he now?" struggling to speak. "He's in the shack," she replied. Anthony made a move towards the shack, but was stopped by the woman's clinging hands. She looked up at him with sad, searching eyes. He let out a laugh, but it was empty of any real emotion. "No, I can't get angry. I can't be a man anymore. This Death Valley and you have messed with my head. But I'll tell you what, nothing will stop me from beating Veery so he never does that again." "Ah, so I've messed with your head? Then it's the only great thing I've ever done," she retorted. "Wansfell, I told you Veery has threatened to shoot you. He's done it before, but when you've come around he's been too scared, but he might." "I wish he would try it," Anthony replied, freeing himself from her grasp and approaching the shack. "Veery, come out," he shouted without much feeling. There was no response, so he called out again, louder this time. Still, there was no answer. Anthony waited a moment before speaking again, his voice cold and deliberate. "Veery, I don't want to mess up that room with all your wife's belongings in there, so come outside." Anthony heard a quick, panting breath before Veery appeared at the door of the shack, carrying a gun. Anthony couldn't make out the man's distorted face, but he could feel the ferocity in his heart, even if his will was weak. "Don't you lay one of your bloody hands on me," Veery warned. Anthony took 2 long strides and stood before Veery, only 6 feet away. "So you got yourself a little piece, huh?" he asked casually. Anthony had to control his anger to prevent himself from acting recklessly. "What do you plan on doing with it?" he heard himself say through gritted teeth. "If you come any closer, I'll shoot," Veery panted out, his voice hoarse with excitement. "Listen, Veery," Anthony said in a monotone voice as if reciting from memory. "I'm going to beat you within an inch of your life, but I need to talk first. I have a million things to say to you." "I'm not going to listen to you," Veery replied, his body shaking with rage. The idea of using the gun had taken hold of him, and he couldn't resist the urge. "Get out of my camp and leave this valley." "Are you out of your mind?" Anthony asked incredulously. He realized that he couldn't reason with Veery. He had to act quickly before things got worse. But it was hard not to try to make Veery see reason. "If you're not crazy, then what you did to your wife was despicable. To torture her like that, like a heathen. She's a delicate woman with fragile nerves. You picked on her weakness like a child. Veery, if you're not crazy, you're worse than any beast I've ever met in the desert. You've sunk lower than men who've been turned into animals by the desert." "I'm a beast because of my wife," Veery cried out bitterly. "Delicate? Ha! Magdalene Veery's last lover can't see that she's as strong as steel, as alive as fire. She clings to her memories like a cat with 9 lives. She holds on to them just to remember." "You meddling desert rat of a preacher, get out or I'll kill you," shouted Veery. "Shoot and be damned," retorted Anthony as he swiftly dodged Veery's attack. Veery's face turned pale as he raised his gun, but Anthony knocked it up just in time as it exploded. The powder burned Anthony's forehead, but the bullet missed its target. Anthony then knocked the gun out of Veery's hand and dragged him towards Mrs. Veery, who sat on a stone bench looking scared. Anthony tripped Viry and threw him heavily on the sand. He then straddled him, pinning him down. Anthony dug his big right hand into the sand and uncovered a dead tarantula. "Ah, here's your spider," he exclaimed, rubbing the hairy, half-crushed tarantula in Viry's face. Viry screamed and struggled as Anthony tried to force the spider into his open mouth. "Eat it, damn your cowardly soul," Anthony taunted, smearing the crushed tarantula all over Viry's face. Viry managed to close his teeth tightly, but Anthony didn't stop tormenting him. "Now get up," Anthony ordered, kicking Viry as he rose to his feet. Anthony was now in control of his emotions and held back from killing Viry. He reveled in the joy of violence that surged through him, but restrained himself from tearing Viry apart limb by limb. Viry, now furious, leaped at Anthony, only to receive a blow that knocked him back onto the sand. He quickly got up, bleeding and livid, and charged at Anthony again. His anger gave him strength, and in that moment he had no fear of anyone or anything. He was consumed by the desert rage. He swung his fists, wildly beat Anthony, tore and clawed at him. Anthony retaliated by slapping him with his large hands that sounded like boards clapping together. When Viry got too close, Anthony closed his fist and punched him in the face, causing the man to fall into the sand. Viry then crawled on his hands and knees like a dog until he found a stone to throw at Anthony. Anthony dodged the missile, and Viry continued to throw more rocks. Anthony caught one of them and threw it back, hitting Viry's shin hard. Viry yelled in pain, but his rage only grew. He picked up a large rock, held it like a mace, and charged at Anthony with the intent to kill him. This was the only significant response he had to the wild environment. He beat at Anthony and lunged at him, but Anthony was too strong for him. Viry might have succeeded in killing someone weaker than Anthony, but he was powerless against him. Finally, Anthony knocked the rock out of Viry's hand and began to beat him relentlessly with controlled strength, causing Viry to stagger around, supported only by Anthony's fists. Eventually, Viry fell to the sand, defeated and moaning. Anthony dragged him into the shack and left him there, a broken man who realized his condition. The hardest part for Anthony was facing Mrs. Viry. He realized then that he knew nothing about women. "Did the bullet hit you when he fired?" she asked, her big eyes intense and glowing, wonderfully dark with emotion flashing over him. "No, it missed me," panted Anthony as he sank onto the stone bench, breathing heavily. "I picked up the gun. I was afraid he'd find it. You should keep it now," she said, slipping it into his pocket. "What a disgusting sight for you to have to watch," exclaimed Anthony, trying to speak and breathe at the same time. "It was terrible at first," she replied. "But after the gun went flying and you had stopped trying to make him eat the spider, oh, how sickening. After that it got to be, well, Wansfell, it was the first time in all the years I've known my husband that I respected him. It amazed me. I admired him. And as for you, to see you tower over him and parry his blows and hit him when you liked and knock him and drag him, oh, that roused a terrible something in me. I never felt like that before in my whole life. I was some other woman. I watched the blood flow. I heard the thuds and heavy breaths. I actually smelled the heat of you. I was so close, and it all inflamed me, made me strung with savage excitement. I had almost said joy. God knows, Wansfell, we have hidden natures within our breasts. If only it's a lesson to him, sighed Anthony. Then it would be well done, she replied. But I doubt. Viry is hopeless. Let us forget. And now will you please help me search in the sand here for something I dropped? It fell from my lap when I fainted, I suppose. It's a small ivory case with a miniature I think all the world of. Last and best of my treasures. Anthony searched in the sand along the base of the bench and soon found the lost treasure. With a passionate and eloquent cry of rapture, she clutched the little case and exclaimed, "Look!" She held the case open before Anthony's eyes, revealing a miniature painting of a girl's face. The face was oval and pure like a flower, with beautiful curls of dark bronze and magnificent eyes. Anthony recognized the mother of this girl in the eyes, the pride and the fire, if not the color. "A sweet and lovely face," he said. "Ruth," she whispered. "My daughter, my only child, my baby that I abandoned to save her happiness. Oh, the mockery of life that I was given such a heart to love and such a perfect child." The midsummer midnight furnace winds began to blow. They did not blow every night or many nights consecutively, otherwise all life in the valley would soon have become extinct. Anthony found the hot winds, which he had imagined were those for which the valley was famed, were really comfortable compared to these terrible furnace blasts. In trying to understand their nature, Anthony concluded they were caused by a displacement of higher currents of cool air. Sometime during the middle of the night there began a downward current of cool air from the mountain heights, causing a disturbance of the vast area of hot air in the burning valley below sea level. The tremendous pressure drove the hot air to find an outlet so it could rise to let the cool air down, and thus there came gusts and gales of furnace winds, rushing down the valley and roaring up the canyons. The camp of the Virays, almost in the center of one of these outlets and scarcely a quarter of a mile from the main valley, lay open to the full fury of these winds. The 1st of August was a hazy, blistering day in which the valley smoked. Transparent black veils and white moving heat shrouds covered the mountains, making their peaks invisible and their bases showing a dull, sinister red through the haze. The sun seemed to have burst, creating a terrible heaven-wide heat that would burn a man if he touched an unshaded stone with his bare hand. It was a solemn, silent, and deadly day, inimical to life. Finally, the sunset of red hell ended the day, and merciful darkness intervened. The forepart of the night was hot but endurable, and a relief compared to the scorching sunlit hours. However, Anthony noticed a singular ominous reddish hue of the dim stars, a vast still veil between him and the sky, a waiting hush. He walked out into the open, peering through the dimness, trying to comprehend the color of the stars, heavens, and the dull black slopes. They all seemed like a world burned out, immense, dim, mysterious, empty, and desolate. Anthony wondered if this death valley had finally unhinged his mind, but he convinced himself that what he was experiencing was normal. The unreality, terror, forbidding hush of all the elements, and the imminence of catastrophe were all actually present. Anything could happen here, and exaggeration of sense was impossible. This death valley was only a niche of the universe, and the universe was only a part of the infinite. He felt his intelligence and emotion, and at the same time the conviction that only a step away was death. The old wonder arose. Was death the end? It was not possible. Yet the cruelty and impassivity of nature, letting the iron consequences fall, seemed to crush him. For the sake of a woman who suffered agony of body and mind, Anthony was at war with nature and the spirit of creation. Why? The eternal query had no answer and never would be answered. As the hours ticked by, the air grew thicker and hotter, smothering Anthony like a heavy blanket. This night was unlike any other he had experienced in the desert. It was hot, still, oppressive, and downright strange. Sleep was out of the question, as was any kind of rest or inactivity. Every breath felt like a struggle, as if his lungs were being constricted by an invisible force. Despite this, he forced himself to walk, but even this simple act caused a hot sweat to pour down his body, the drops burning as they trailed down his skin. "If the winds blow tonight," he muttered, his voice laced with fear. He knew they would blow, harder and hotter than ever before. The scorching day had promised as much, and nature had her own midnight change to make in the elements. Time marched on, the universe continued its inscrutable course, and Anthony clung to this ball of rock hurtling through space, groaning with the other pygmies of his kind. It was all so inconceivable, so unbelievable. Suddenly a movement of air fanned his cheek, emphasizing the warmth and bringing with it the scent of dry alkali dust and smoky brimstone. The hour was nearing midnight, and the deathly silence was broken by a low, mournful moan that seemed to come from nowhere. It was eerie, dismal, and uncanny, fitting in perfectly with the spectral shadows and shapes around him. It was not a human sound, but it resembled the mournful cry of humanity. A puff of hot wind rushed by, rustling the dead and withered brush before settling into an uneasy stillness. Anthony knew what was coming. From the depths of Death Valley came a sudden burst of life as the ferocious winds of hell roared through the dead air. Anthony, with his keen ears attuned to the sounds of the desert, listened in awe as the low, mournful moan grew louder and swelled to a roar. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard before, and it seemed to have an eerie connection to the shadows of the abyss. As the wind grew stronger, the air around Anthony began to move steadily northward, and its density increased. The rustling of the brush signaled the approach of the storm, and soon the roar of wind filled the valley. When the gale reached the gateway below Anthony, it let out a hollow bellow, and the last of the warm, still air was pushed away, leaving a vacuum. The hot blast of wind struck Anthony with a burning, withering force, as if he had suddenly come face to face with an open furnace. He could barely breathe, and the wind carried sand, dust, and even shadows with it. Just when the blast seemed to be dying down, another, even louder and stronger, whooped up through the gateway and blew down Anthony's sun shelter of brush. As the contending tides of wind raged on, life became a torment for Anthony, a man of the desert. Yet in the face of these furnace winds, his tenacity for life took on a new meaning. The struggle to breathe was like trying to survive in the harshest of conditions. Anthony knew he had to endure if he wanted to live. It was tough, even tougher than traversing a sandstorm or a scorching desert to reach a water source. But he had no choice. His lungs were working involuntarily, and it was painful. The burning sensation, the unquenchable thirst, the dusty air, the scorching heat, the dim red starlight, and the eerie silence all added to the challenge. Anthony understood why no one could survive in Death Valley for long. "She won't make it through the night," Anthony muttered to himself. He knew that if Magdalene Viry survived the night, he would take her away. The idea had been growing in his mind, but tonight it reached a climax. If Magdalene showed any signs of weakness or a change in spirit, Anthony knew he couldn't endure it any longer. Anthony slowly made his way towards the Viry camp, which was barely visible in the dim red light. Magdalene would be lying or sitting on the stone bench outside the shack. The inside was impossible to breathe in, and even the furnace winds had to be fought for the air of life. Magdalene didn't have the strength to move around, and Anthony could see Viry staggering back and forth like a lost old man. The sight filled Anthony with a moment of satisfaction. He hated Viry for his selfishness and his fall from grace, and even Magdalene's influence couldn't keep Anthony from feeling that way. The selfishness of human nature is unparalleled. The obsession with oneself, the constant use of I, me, and mine, the pathetic pettiness that cannot forgive or comprehend. Anthony, despite his hatred, felt pity for the woman lying motionless on the bench. She was a fragile shape, white and limp, with unfathomable eyes that stirred something in him that he couldn't explain. They were eyes that never slept, haunted and supernaturally bright, reflecting the dim stars. They were eyes of melancholy, passion, and spirit, the eyes of a woman in love. Anthony held her wasted hand, waiting for the wind to die down so he could speak to her. When it finally did, he couldn't bear to see her suffering any longer. He could have endured her spiritual turmoil, her remorse, and her bravery in the face of Viry's hate. But he couldn't stand to see her wasting away, burning up with fever. Her hand was hot as fire and dry as a leaf. She needed water. "Magdalene, I can't take it any more," he said. "Not the winds of hell, but your suffering, your physical torment. You're wasting away. You're burning up. You need to drink more water." Magdalene whispered back, too weak to lift her head. Anthony lifted it for her and gave her water to drink. As he laid her back down, another blast of wind came roaring through the valley. It moaned and wailed around the boulders and through the brush, a dance of wind fiends hounding the lost spirits of this cursed place. Anthony felt his blood tighten and burn, stinging his skin and extremities. The struggle for survival in Death Valley was overwhelming. The wind was so strong that it felt like his body was trying to escape through his pores. Viry was out there in the darkness, barely able to stand under the weight of his fate. He didn't make a sound. He was like a ghost.